I've been covering the Middle East for 40 years, and nothing changes. Nothing I've written or reported or anybody else has written or reported had any impact at all. The morning after the election, the last US presidential election, my editor at Bloomsbury called, and it was literally, she's in London, and it was literally before most Americans were even awake. And she called and she said, we need to do a new edition of the book, take it out up through Gaza, through the Trump election, and I want to do this quickly, turn it around, and get it out there. And I said, I don't really want to. I was so tired of the Middle East. It was kind of a gruesome Groundhog Day. Same story over and over. Every administration came in, made the same mistakes, and left the same trail of blood. And I really had had it. So I thought about it, and I had just finished Lessons from the Mountaintop. The editing of it had just been completed. It was now with the publisher, and my hands were washed. I thought about a couple of things, and one was this election, because of Gaza. I mean, first of all, Gaza was so monumental, it was hard to just ignore Gaza. And then the second thing was that in the first election, every Muslim American voted against Trump. I'm generalizing, but 99% did. Because he ran on a platform that weaponized Islamophobia. This time around, because American Muslims and other Arabs were so angry at the Biden administration, and then Kamala, because of Gaza, that they formed Muslims for Trump organizations. And by the end of the day, by the election itself, many of the Muslims who were saying, we're going to vote for him, didn't. They just didn't vote, which was effectively a vote for Trump, because they had all voted for Biden the first time around. And so I decided that this really was the great irony that summed up this tragically flawed relationship between America writ large and the world's Muslims. So I said, okay, I'll do the book. But I really had to pause, and I really had to take a breath and ask myself, do I want to do this? Because, literally, I arrived in Lebanon in 1980, and I was there to watch the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and then the tragic American intervention that was meant to be a defense of the Palestinians, and ended up a war against the Shia and the Druze. And it was because, as always, we had a president, in this case Ronald Reagan, who saw the Middle East in black and white, simplistic terms. In his case, it's white hats and black hats. And so he said, I'm there to defend the legitimate government of Lebanon, when there was no legitimate government of Lebanon. Lebanon is not black and white, it's a sea of gray. And so that ended up causing this conflict with the Shia and Druze. And as a result, what happened? They gave birth to Hezbollah, which was, before 9/11, the most powerful radical organization in the world. Killed far more Americans than any other organization. A couple of years later, and at that point, Americans were saying, why did they do this? The morning of the Marine barracks bombing, 243 American service people killed in the Marine barracks bombing, truck bomb by a Hezbollah operative. I had been out there shooting hoops with these guys the night before and drinking beer. And at 6:20 in the morning, I was woken up by the blast, let's put it that way. The whole building shook, and we were a couple of miles from the blast site. This was the largest non-nuclear explosion to date since World War II. And I got out there and saw bits of American Marines hanging from the trees. And I knew why this happened. And Americans watching television all started asking, why did this happen? And it happened because of American policy. A year before that, the Americans had effectively allowed Israel to allow its Christian militia allies into the southern suburbs of Lebanon, of Beirut, and massacred thousands of Shia and Palestinians. We watched from East Beirut, on the roof of a building, watched Israeli helicopters dropping flares over the camps to light the way for these guys to come in. And it was a horrible tragedy. I took that videotape to Damascus that same day and played it for Yasser Arafat. This is long before there were satellites, obviously. And he watched this and he turned to me and he said, this is the Americans' fault. They promised they would keep the Israelis, keeping their allies in line, and the Palestinians and Shia would be protected. It's their fault. And I heard the same thing a couple of years later when I met with the Iranian ambassador in Lebanon, who was the guy who was coordinating all of the anti-American terror in Lebanon. And I was there to interview him and then make a plea for a friend of mine who was a hostage at the time. And he said, your friend is innocent, they're all innocent, but they're suffering for American policy. And as we move forward through history, nothing changed. America, shock and awe in Iraq gave birth to ISIS. Before that, the support for the jihadis in Afghanistan and the war against the Russians gave birth to the modern day jihad. The American intervention in the Gulf War ultimately gave birth to Al Qaeda, because that's why bin Laden moved into a radical terrorist approach, because the American troops were in Saudi Arabia and he opposed that. So he brought his jihadis back together, and that's what sparked Al Qaeda, and on and on and on. It's a tragedy that just keeps replaying itself over and over and over. And now we're sitting in a place where we're hearing the same rhetoric, we're seeing the same worldview that we've seen for decades. Way back when George Bush was talking about the war on terror, and he talked about mounting a crusade against terror. Now, he probably just meant it as, a cute word for war, struggle, whatever, but that resonates among the world's Muslims. A couple of months ago, when the US government took over the distribution of aid in Gaza and threw all the humanitarian organizations out, the guys that they brought in to safeguard these distributions were former American soldiers from Iraq who were members of a motorcycle gang called the Infidels, who wore the Crusader cross on their jackets. And we are surprised that violence resulted when food was distributed. So this worldview has existed long before the George Bushes and the Ronald Reagans. Pre-independence in the US, Muslims were already the enemy. We had Christian fundamentalist preachers fulminating against Muhammad. We had Thomas Jefferson and John Adams accused by their opponents of being a modern-day Muhammad. The American Navy was formed to fight Muslims, formed to fight the Barbary pirates. And we have a stanza in the American national anthem that nobody talks about, nobody sings, but it is based on, it was written after the Barbary War, and it talked about the turbaned head bowing, and the crescent moon flag being pulled down and replaced by the American flag. So this runs very, very deep in our psyche. We're now moving into a place where we have traded just this hidden Islamophobic view of the Muslim world, traded a naive and simplistic approach to the Middle East that ignores history for a cynical approach to the Middle East, under which money is king, people don't matter, and America first in every sense of the word. There's about a month or two ago, a report was leaked that is the Trump administration game plan for Gaza. And let me pull out a couple, there are some amazing quotes in it. The whole approach is based on, it's called the Great Blueprint. It's Gaza Reconstruction, Economic Acceleration and Transformation. And it sets up Gaza as a logistics gateway for the Middle East. There's a glossy brochure that is basically it looks like a real estate prospectus. And it has these pictures of Gaza as kind of Dubai on steroids. Talks about, for example, an EV industrial zone where EV companies gain profits while giving a better future to Palestinians and Israelis. And it's part of the, quote, Abrahamic framework, and will produce a new American regional architecture. 25% of Gazans will be invited to leave Gaza. But when they run the numbers, the more Palestinians leave, the higher the profits. I mean, it's literally in black and white in this report. And the strategic benefit to the U.S. is strengthening the hold on the Eastern Mediterranean, securing U.S. industry access to $1.3 trillion of rare earth materials from the Gulf. And the most telling quote is, "This plan aims to address one of Gaza's ongoing insurgency's root causes, urban design." That is the root cause of radicalization and violence in Gaza. Urban design, according to the Trump administration. Needless to say, among all of the things that have been ignored with history is the root causes of radicalism. I mean, after 9/11, the US government, European governments spent trillions of dollars on studies on what causes radicalism, what causes someone to become a radical. Urban design was obviously not one of them. And what we've been watching in Gaza is real-time radicalization. I mean, hatred produces hatred generations worth. We've seen this from Afghanistan to Beirut to Iraq and on and on. And now we're going to see it in Gaza. Imagine that you're a 12-year-old boy in Gaza. Your parents have been killed. Your aunts and uncles have been killed. Your brothers and sisters died when your building collapsed under Israeli bombs. And you're alone in the world. What is your future? All the research on terrorism shows that exposure to violence is the primary driver of radicalization. Individuals radicalized through progressive exposure to violent political actions. One study of Palestinian suicide bombers, kids between the ages of 12 and 17, who had been groomed to be suicide bombers and they were then captured by the Israelis before, or were being groomed and the researchers got to them, found that they all reported that they had had relatives killed or wounded or jailed by the Israelis. So that is a primary motivator of violence. And that is the daily life for a Palestinian child now. To date, obviously 70,000 Palestinians dead, 1/3 of them are children. There are more amputees in Gaza than anywhere else in the world. There are more children who've lost their families than anywhere else in the world. And then as a journalist, I'll add that more journalists have been killed in Gaza than in every war since World War II. So, back to those drivers of violence. Abandonment, injustice, stigmatization, uncertainty, family dysfunction, and exposure to radicals. Pretty much describes life in Gaza right now. A NATO study exposed Western students to all of these drivers of radicalization. Western students at universities in Europe. And they, by the end of the process, they were exhibiting all of the same motivations of a suicide bomber. They wanted revenge, they wanted to fight injustice, and they wanted to counter humiliation. And these are European students at a university. Imagine a kid on the ground in Gaza. 6 weeks before Hamas launched its assault in Israel, the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East warned of an explosion of violence fueled and exacerbated by a growing sense of despair about the future. That was before the Gaza war. Imagine those kids today. I mean, I've talked to, that old line, some of my best friends have been terrorists, right? And I mean, literally, I've known people who were involved in the Munich massacre and various other atrocities pre-Lebanon and then in Lebanon and beyond. And many of them will sit over a lunch with you or over coffee with you and make a very sound and logical argument for violence. The guy who was involved in the Munich massacre, the Olympics massacre, said the world was ignoring us. The world had forgotten about the Palestinians. We had tried everything diplomatically. We had tried everything in terms of the media. Nothing worked. And so we were driven to do this. And they were, it was the first real use of media by terrorists. And it was powerful because the world was watching the Olympics in Munich and this atrocity happened. And so it worked in their terms. Months later, Yasser Arafat is addressing the UN General Assembly. And the Palestinians were on the radar screen. And they learned from this. Other groups that had been marginalized learned from this. Manipulation of the media, violence, sadly, worked. They get the world's attention. I remember sitting with a young guy, and is probably about 17, 18 years old, in the mountains of Lebanon, overlooking the Beirut and the Marine encampment at the airport in Lebanon. And at the time, the USS New Jersey was shelling the Shia and Druze positions. This was the Druze I was sitting with. The New Jersey is a battleship that fires shells the size of a Volkswagen, literally the size of a Volkswagen. We would sit in downtown Beirut in our apartments, and when the ship fired, the windows would rattle, or if the windows were open, the curtains would blow, and we'd feel the implosion in our eardrums. That's how huge these things were. And so they were bombing the Druze areas up in the mountains. And he said, we don't have a USS New Jersey. And we're literally sitting in the hills and we can see the New Jersey out offshore, about a mile outside. And he said, but we have trucks and we have explosives. And so we use those. And how different is it for us to roll a truck full of explosives into a position than for them to fire a truck-size explosive on us? And it's a hard argument, obviously. Then you get into what is your target? Is it military? Is it civilian, et cetera? But the level of anger, the level, you got two of you are Syrians, you know this. I don't have to tell you. I mean, the level of humiliation, the level of fear is huge. And whether we're talking about among the people who have survived, the 700,000 who died in Iraq, in the Iraq wars, in the 10 years or whatever it was after George Bush declared mission accomplished, or whether you're talking about Afghans who watched America's 20-year involvement in Afghanistan, and that resulted in tens of thousands of deaths and a resurgent Taliban, and all of the women who were promised a better life and education are back under the veil, or come back to Gaza now. It is hard to see how Gaza does not, no matter what this administration does in terms of, creating some kind of a truce in Gaza, creating some kind of peace in Gaza, which is very hard to see. We have a ceasefire of convenience right now. Trump has declared the war over, but in the last 2 days, more than 200 Gazans have died under Israeli bombs, and Israel bombs them and then says, all right, we're back to the ceasefire, and then bombs them again and says, okay, we're back to the ceasefire. That's not peace. And I pity, the Arabs have already announced that they will not take part in this security force that's supposed to go into Gaza and, maintain the peace. Now they're talking about Indonesia and Malaysia and various other places. I pity any of these groups that go in there because, we already saw a few weeks ago the aside from violence by Hamas, now you're going to have Beirut all over again. You're going to have a free-for-all of militias that are going to be nipping at the heels of the peacekeepers, that are going to be fighting each other over turf, fighting each other over humanitarian aid. And rather than being a new Dubai, Gaza for a very long time to come is going to be a new Beirut. Well, one other thing I'll add is that what has been odd in the last few weeks is juxtaposing this and this. So, as most of you know, Lessons from the Mountaintop is about mystics. It came out in August in the US, it came out here this month, and this literally comes out today. And so I'm kind of left brain, right brain social media trying to figure out how do I promote a book about mystics and a book about 4 decades or more, well, hundreds of years of disaster. Yeah, there's a question mark at the end of that, I know. In the modern era, let's forget about colonial times, et cetera, that whole history of Islamophobia. In the modern era, America, in the eyes of the world's Muslims, has been joined at the hip with Israel. That's true since the 60s, and particularly the 70s and on. When I talked about meeting with the Iranian ambassador in Damascus, Ali Akbar Mohtashamapour, who was literally the guy pulling the strings on all of the anti-American violence in Lebanon, all the suicide bombings, all of the kidnappings, et cetera, et cetera. And when I walked into, and I was the first American he had ever met, and it was amazing that he agreed to meet with me. He wouldn't, I was with CBS at the time, he wouldn't allow a camera, but he allowed me to quote him. And I walked into his office and I put out my hand to shake his hand, and he reached out with his left hand instead, because his right hand was a rubber fake. His left hand is missing a couple of fingers as well, and it was because a CIA bomb had blown up in that office that we were meeting in, and blown off his hand. Now, that was obviously in retaliation for stuff he had done theoretically, et cetera. But when I made this plea for Terry Anderson, who was a good friend of mine, the AP correspondent in Lebanon, who had been at that point held hostage for about 2 years. And when I said, but Terry's innocent, he's a reporter, he was there telling the Shia story, et cetera, he said, he's innocent, they're all innocent, but as long as America supports Israel in a special way, this is going to continue to happen. So yeah, and needless to say, in the perspective of most of the world in terms of Gaza, America, the Biden administration, supported Israel hook, line, and sinker. This is why most American Muslims didn't vote for Biden or overtly voted against him. Trump, at rallies with American Muslims, said, I'm going to end the war. 2 weeks after the election, he announced the most pro-Israel cabinet in American history. And I have in here, because again, this takes in that period, one of the people who had led one of these Muslims for Trump organization said, I guess we were taken for a ride. No kidding, right? Now, he's in a unique situation now in that he has built this bridge to the Gulf Arabs. The Gulf Arabs, as our Syrian friends will tell you, the Gulf Arabs have never cared about Palestine. It's all about show. It's all about placating the masses. But now they are joined at the hip with Israel quietly. The Abraham Accords brought some of them in, but that's immaterial. They're joined on an intelligence level. They're buying weapons from Israel. There's Israeli IT people down there running their spy infrastructure networks. And this plan to turn Gaza into a depot has to do with joint ventures. I mean, the Saudis have bought into Israeli oil companies offshore. So economically, in terms of security, they're joined at the hip. And of course, Trump now has a foot in both camps. So is actually in a unique place to drive some kind of an enforced peace. But whether that's a peace that the Palestinians are going to like is a whole different conversation. No one's going to come in and do something that is going to undo a peace if a peace is in place. Now, the bigger issue is what happens to the Palestinians. Let's say for the sake of argument, and I believe it when I see it, but let's say for the sake of argument, a Democrat is elected in the next round. They may take a much more proactive approach to trying to resolve the Palestinian crisis, but it's not likely they will, because nobody's been able to do it. So why are they going to take it on? Why are they going to take the chance of upsetting the apple cart when the West Bank is already lost to the Palestinians? It was lost to them before Gaza. The distraction of Gaza has unleashed the radical right in Israel to do what it wants on the West Bank. So it's made it that much more difficult to bring about any kind of a resolution, because you have so many settlements in so many places, and the Palestinians are so backs against the wall that it's hard to see any resolution there. And Gaza, who the heck knows? No, 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 no. No, no, it was here. The UK drove it. Yeah, I mean, it was very much driven by in the UK, out of the UK. Obviously, it took off after World War II as a result of World War II. But its roots were here. And in fact, the US really didn't support much of what was going on around Israel and the homeland, et cetera, until the 60s. It was very much hands-off. In many ways, anti-Israeli up until then. What's going to be interesting to watch now is how Gaza shapes American public opinion on Israel in the long term. Because all of the polls are showing, first of all, the American Jewish community is very split around Gaza. In fact, in writing Lessons from the Mountaintop, one of the chapters is on an American woman rabbi in New York who created revived priestesses within kind of the mystic end of Judaism. And her organization, would do retreats, and they'd all course for priestesses, et cetera. And then because of some internal stuff and personalities, they were shaky, and they finally decided to dissolve the organization. And she and others who were involved, and this happened about a month and a half before October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel. And she said, thank God we did, because we would have been at each other's throats, because there was such a division among our women around supporting the Israeli retaliation in Gaza and opposing it. And that's, trickling down across American Judaism. And I saw something just the other day about polls among younger American Jews and then polls among younger Americans in general. The attitudes, not against Israel per se among the Jewish population, but against the Zionists, the Zionist enterprise. And in terms of non-Jewish young Americans, a strong shift against Israel, which is, why there's such a battle going on right now, driven by the Trump administration to quash anti-Israel sentiment and conflating being anti-Israel with being anti-Jewish. Well, Israel has been very effective in the U.S. at building their ties to American Jewry, and not in any kind of a bad way. I mean, they're really good at public relations, and they, for years and years and years, did things like free. If you have Jewish blood, you can have a free trip to Israel for the summer to live on a kibbutz and help plant the oranges, et cetera, et cetera. That's really effective. And you didn't have, well, first of all, you didn't have media saturation. You had finite wars. So yes, there were several Arab-Israeli wars. They were a lot easier to justify than Gaza. You had the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, but Israel made a cogent argument for why they invaded Lebanon. Palestinians were firing on northern Israel, et cetera. This is a different ball of wax, because the footage is so graphic and it's so unrelenting, and this has gone on so long now, and so many American Jews are saying, I love Israel, the concept and the nation, but I don't love this government. Just like I can be an American and love my country and hate my government, and you can do the same in the UK, et cetera. So there's nothing wrong with that. But it's that long-term public relations effort, and then, very effective in terms of financial support for political candidates, et cetera, et cetera. And many Americans did vote based primarily on a given candidate's attitude toward Israel, and forgetting other issues. First question, what is Hamas and what do they have in mind? I have no doubt that Hamas wanted exactly this to happen. I don't think they wanted to find themselves annihilated, but they absolutely wanted to spark a war, because what was happening, back to the Gulf Arabs, what was happening was, in his first administration, Trump had managed to put together this Abraham Accords of a peace deal with a handful of countries and Israel. Excuse me, the Saudis held back, Qatar held back initially, I believe, and a couple of the kind of proxies. I may get this wrong, but I think Bahrain was one of the countries, Morocco was one of the countries that signed on to this. But the Palestinians saw this snowballing with the second Trump administration. And, I mean, with or without Trump, but it was clear Trump was going to win. And the way to stop this was to start a war, because then the Gulf Arabs would have to support the Palestinians. They couldn't be seen to support Israel. They couldn't be seen to be, and this is literally what happened. The Saudis and others told the Trump administration, we can't do this now, not happening. Let's see what happens after everything calms down. So that was absolutely their end game. Again, I don't think they anticipated the blowback being at quite this level. The other interesting thing to know about Hamas is that Hamas was effectively a creation of the Israeli government. Hamas, it's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Sheikh Yassin, who is the figurehead leader of Hamas, 20 odd years ago, time blurs at this point in my life, he was actually allowed out of prison by Menachem Begin and allowed to leave Israel, the West Bank, to do a tour through the Middle East. He went to Iran, he went to various Arab capitals to raise money. And Begin, at the time, there's a quote from him in there. He said something to the effect of, "I've created a ticking time bomb on Yasser Arafat's doorstep." The idea was divide and rule the Palestinians. And, it did. It created that for a while. The fact that Hamas was ruling Gaza while the Palestinian Authority, which is a antecedent of or a descendant of Arafat's PLO, was ruling the West Bank, underlines this split. So yes, that worked, but of course it put a ticking time bomb on Israel's doorstep as well. And even right now, we've seen, I made reference to other Palestinian splinter groups causing trouble, fighting Hamas in recent weeks, causing trouble, attacking aid shipments, etc. Well, there are a lot of experts who claim that some of those groups are in fact being funded and supported by Israel to do precisely what they're doing, cause problems, make it look like Hamas isn't in control and they're still being violent. Sadly, Europe is a sideshow. It really is. On the surface, they're recognizing the Palestinian state, but what does that even mean, right? mean, the Palestinians can't even go to the UN, for crying out loud. Not allowed in New York. Meanwhile, they're part and parcel of this whole energy deal that I talked about before. The Europeans are deeply involved in that because they want that energy too. So they're playing both ends against the middle. And the reality is that, through force of personality, Trump is the guy. He's controlling everything. If this works, it'll be because of him. If it doesn't work, it may be because of him. But if it works, it's not going to be because the UK recognized the Palestinian state. I mean, so much of this is driven by media, obviously. And the reason, in my view, the reason much of this was never brought to the fore before was that, and another of my frustrations in being a journalist covering the region, every time there's a blow up like this, people ask that, in the West ask that question, why? Why is this happening, right? Right about 2 or 3 weeks after, actually it was early November of the year, 2 years ago, after October 7th, I was watching CNN and a friend of mine, who's one of the Middle East correspondents, was talking about violence on the West Bank and the fact that, I forget the number, but a lot of Palestinians had been killed in the previous 3 weeks. And the anchor, some silly woman who had never been out of the US, sitting in Atlanta or somewhere, said to him, well, but so is this new? And if I could just see on his face if he could said, you but he said, no, this isn't new. This is going on a long time. But the bottom line is that we don't cover this stuff. The American media doesn't cover it, and it's not a nefarious thing. It's just that it becomes white noise, sadly. And, more Palestinians are being killed and more people in Sudan are being killed and whatever. So it's just not covered. But even, I remember at one point, I found a story that the most Palestinians had been killed on the West Bank, more Palestinians had been killed on the West Bank in the previous week or whatever it was than in 6 months or 2 years, highest toll ever. And it was on like page 47 of the New York Times. And this is the problem. We only focus on the story when it's really burning. And what has changed here is that it has been burning for so long. And despite the Israelis' best efforts to not have it covered, never allowed Western journalists into Gaza. It was all through Palestinian lenses. And then, of course, they claimed these guys were all terrorists, right? But, despite their best efforts, we had this relentless coverage, and that's what's changing minds. And I mean, in terms of, back to your question of American Christians, we've always had this interesting dichotomy of Christian fundamentalists loving Israel because they wanted the Armageddon. The Armageddon is a good thing. That's where it's going to start, so we need to support Israel so it can spark the Armageddon, and we can all be... But that was why, it was kind of scary when George Bush was president, and he was one of those guys, right? He was part of that ideology, that religious ideology, and he had his finger on the button, as it were. So yeah, that is absolutely a factor. Where that line is. So right now, the American ambassador to Israel is a strong pro-Zionist, born-again Christian. Now, does he actually want Armageddon? I don't know. But it is that idea that Israel is fundamentally linked to the end times is a driving force. Yeah. I mean, obviously the first question is, how successful is this Dubai on steroids, right? Do they actually send in 50,000 contractors and build skyscrapers and oil pipelines, et cetera, et cetera? Or is, as is more likely, this a slow process which leaves a lot of room for low-level insurgency, random acts of terror, and that would be my guess as to what this looks like.